Just a story. The woman's voice trembles as it's cut off in the middle of a quiet church. Margaret is 82 years old, her hands shaking slightly as she sits alone on the back pew. "My son is a Marine," she says softly. A few people exchange glances. Someone lets out a quiet laugh. The organizer steps closer, her smile thin, her voice calm but cold. "Stories like that don't belong here." The words hang in the air as the room grows still, dozens of eyes turning to watch her truth quietly pushed aside. Margaret lowers her gaze, her fingers tightening around the old photograph hidden in her coat. She doesn't argue. She doesn't fight. She whispers a prayer to God, not for justice, not for revenge, just to not be alone in this moment. What no one knows. The answer is already on the way, walking through the cold morning in combat boots beside a silent canine. A pale winter light slipped through stained glass as a cold morning settled over a small church in Helena, Montana. Margaret Whitaker paused just inside the doorway before stepping in, as if the air itself required permission. At 82, she had grown used to moving carefully, not only because her body demanded it, but because life had taught her that quiet entrances drew the least attention. She was small, her frame slender and slightly bent at the shoulders, her silver-white hair pinned loosely into a bun that had begun to unravel in the cold. Fine lines traced her pale skin, and her gray eyes carried a softness that did not come from ease, but from endurance. Her coat was old, clean but worn in places that could not be repaired anymore. One sleeve had thinned near the wrist, and a single mismatched button caught the light differently from the others. It was the kind of coat people noticed without realizing why. Inside, the church was already filling. Rows of polished wooden pews stretched toward the front, where white lilies framed a photograph of the man being honored. The scent of candle wax and cold air lingered together, and quiet conversations drifted like low waves across the room. Margaret's gaze moved slowly, not over the decorations, but over the people. She always noticed people first. Who stood close, who avoided looking at others, who spoke too quickly to fill silence. It had become a habit over the years, one she never explained, not even to herself. At the front stood a man in his mid-30s, tall, composed, but carrying a weight he hadn't yet learned how to set down. This was Ethan Cole, the son of the man being remembered. His dark hair was neatly combed, though a few strands refused to stay in place, and his jaw tightened slightly between sentences as he spoke quietly with a few guests. There was something in his posture, held together but strained, that told Margaret he was still somewhere between responsibility and grief. She recognized the photograph near the altar. Thomas Hale. He had known her husband many years ago. Not closely, not in the way people tell stories about, but enough to share a kind of understanding that never needed to be spoken aloud. In a small town, that kind of connection lasted longer than most. Margaret moved toward the back of the church and slid into a seat near the aisle. She preferred the edges of rooms, always had. From there, she could observe without being drawn in, listen without being asked to respond. She folded her hands in her lap, her fingers resting lightly against the fabric of her coat. For a brief moment, they shifted inward, brushing against something hidden in the inner pocket. The movement was small, instinctive. She didn't take it out. She never did, not in places like this. The photograph stayed where it belonged, close but unseen. People continued to arrive. A man with a military bearing took a seat near the front, his posture straight, shoulders squared, even in stillness. Two women dressed in pressed coats leaned toward each other as they spoke, their voices low but animated. Somewhere behind Margaret, a quiet laugh broke and quickly softened into something more appropriate for the setting. The room settled gradually, not into silence, but into something controlled, respectful. Ethan eventually stepped forward, adjusting the papers in his hand. He paused for a moment, as if measuring the room, then began. "Thank you all for coming," he said, his voice steady but quieter than expected. "My father believed in showing up for people. I think he would have appreciated this." A murmur moved through the pews. Margaret listened without shifting. Words like these had a rhythm she knew well. They spoke of service, of sacrifice, of quiet strength. The kinds of things people could describe more easily than they could truly understand. "He respected those who served," Ethan continued, "especially the ones who didn't talk about it." That line stayed. Margaret felt it settle somewhere deep in her chest. Not sharply, not suddenly, but in a way that made her aware of something she carried with her every day without thinking. Around her, people nodded. Someone whispered about deployments. Another mentioned long absences, waiting for calls that came too late or not at all. The words blurred together into something familiar. Margaret's fingers pressed lightly against the inside of her coat again. She hadn't planned to speak. She rarely did. But sometimes the space between silence and truth became thinner than expected. "My son," she said softly. The words barely carried, but they existed. Enough for someone nearby to hear. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't turn. "My son is a Marine." It was simple. No emphasis. No attempt to be heard beyond the space around her. But the words didn't disappear. A woman seated a row ahead shifted slightly, her head turning just enough to glance back. Another person nearby followed the movement. Then another. Margaret felt it before she fully saw it. The change. The way the air around her tightened. The way conversation didn't stop, but adjusted. "A Marine?" someone repeated quietly. Not loud, not harsh, but not neutral. Margaret kept her gaze forward, her posture still. Her hands remained folded, though her fingers tightened slightly against each other. She did not reach for the photograph. Not yet. She had said nothing unusual, nothing untrue. And yet, something in the room had shifted. The attention that found her now was different from before. Not curious, not kind. Measuring. Margaret drew a slow breath, steady and controlled, the way she had learned to do years ago when silence was the only thing she could hold on to. She had not meant to be noticed, but now she was. And the room, quiet as it seemed, was no longer simply listening. It was watching. The quiet attention that had settled around Margaret Whitaker did not fade. It sharpened. For a few seconds, nothing happened. The kind of silence that wasn't truly silent, just thinner, more aware. Margaret remained seated exactly as she was, hands folded neatly in her lap, her gaze still fixed toward the front of the church as if nothing had changed. But she could feel it now, unmistakably. The shift in how the room held her. It was no longer passive observation. It was judgment waiting for confirmation. A woman stepped into the aisle beside her. Carol Hayes was not the kind of person people overlooked. At 50, she carried herself with a practiced confidence that came from years of organizing, managing, and quietly directing rooms like this one. She was of average height, her posture straight and deliberate, her blonde hair cut just above the shoulders in a style that never seemed out of place. Her clothes were understated but clearly chosen with care, a tailored dark coat, soft leather gloves tucked neatly into one hand. Her face was composed, her expression controlled, but her eyes, sharp, attentive, missed very little. Carol had built her place in the community on reliability. She knew who belonged, who didn't, and, more importantly, how to maintain order without raising her voice. It was a skill she valued, one that had served her well for years. And like many who relied on quiet authority, she trusted her judgment more than she questioned it. She stopped just short of Margaret's pew, offering a small, polite smile that never quite reached her eyes. "I'm sorry," Carol said gently, her voice low enough to remain respectful of the setting. "I couldn't help but overhear." Margaret turned her head slightly, just enough to acknowledge her presence. Up close, the difference between them was more noticeable. Carol's coat still held its structure, her posture firm. Margaret's frame seemed smaller somehow, not weaker, but easier to dismiss. Carol's gaze moved, not abruptly, but deliberately, from Margaret's face down to her coat, then back again. "A Marine," Carol repeated, her tone light, almost conversational. Then she gave a small, restrained smile. "Working with a K-9? There was a faint pause after the words, not long enough to be obvious, but long enough to carry meaning. Margaret did not answer immediately. She had learned long ago that silence could hold more weight than defense. Her fingers pressed lightly against each other, steady, controlled. "Yes," she said simply. Carol tilted her head slightly, as if considering the response, though the decision in her eyes had already been made. "You know," she continued, her voice still soft, still measured, "we've organized quite a few services like this over the years." Another small pause. "And we hear a lot of stories." Behind her, one of the seated women leaned just enough to listen more clearly. A man near the aisle shifted, his attention drifting toward the exchange without fully turning. Carol's smile remained, but it thinned. "And if I'm being honest," she added, lowering her voice just slightly, though not enough to prevent others from catching the tone, "they don't usually come from situations like this." The words were careful, polished, not loud enough to cause disruption, but they landed. Margaret felt it, not as a shock, but as a quiet recognition. She had heard variations of that tone before, not always directed at her, not always spoken aloud, but always the same underlying message. "We know what is likely, and you do not fit it." Her gaze remained forward. "I'm not telling a story," she said, just as quietly. Carol let out a soft breath that might have been a laugh if it had carried any warmth. "Of course," she replied quickly. "I'm sure you believe that." The sentence was smooth, almost kind. Almost. "But we do try to keep things," she continued, gesturing lightly toward the front of the church, where Ethan stood speaking to a small group of guests, "appropriate for the occasion." A faint murmur moved through the nearby pews. Not agreement exactly, but acknowledgement. The kind of subtle reinforcement that made one voice feel like several. Margaret felt her fingers shift again, brushing the inside of her coat pocket. The photograph was still there, folded, worn, real. For a moment, she considered leaving it there. But something in the air, the way Carol stood, the way others listened without intervening, made that silence feel different now. Not dignified, not protective. Dismissed. Margaret reached slowly into her coat. The movement was small, but it drew attention. Carol's eyes followed it immediately, her expression sharpening with quiet curiosity. Margaret pulled out the photograph, careful not to unfold it too quickly. The edges were worn, softened by years of being handled more often than shown. She held it for a moment, looking down at it, not as proof, but as something familiar. Then she extended it toward Carol. "My son," she said. Carol hesitated just long enough to make the gesture feel inconvenient before taking the photograph between two fingers. She glanced at it briefly. A man in uniform, a dog beside him, a posed image like many others. Her eyes did not linger. "I see," Carol said, handing it back almost immediately. The dismissal was subtle, efficient. "I'm not sure where this came from," she added, her tone still controlled, still low. "But this really isn't the place for things that can't be verified." A man a few seats away shifted, leaning slightly toward another as if to comment. The whisper didn't quite reach Margaret's ears, but she didn't need to hear it. The meaning was already clear. Margaret took the photograph back, her fingers closing around it with care. She did not look at Carol this time. "I'm not asking anyone to verify anything," she said. Her voice remained steady, not defensive, not pleading, just quiet. Carol's expression tightened, not visibly, not in a way most would notice, but enough to signal that the exchange had reached its limit. "Well," she said softly, straightening just slightly, "we're about to begin. I'd appreciate it if we could keep the focus where it belongs." It wasn't a request. She gave Margaret one last measured look, then turned and stepped back into the aisle, her presence blending smoothly back into the order she had been maintaining. But something had changed. The people nearby did not return to their earlier conversations. Not fully. Their voices lowered further. Their glances came more often now, quicker, more deliberate. The kind of attention that didn't seek understanding, only confirmation. Margaret lowered her gaze to her hands. The photograph rested there for a moment before she folded it again, slower this time, more carefully, and slipped it back into her pocket. Her fingers lingered against the fabric. She did not feel anger. She did not feel the need to explain. What she felt instead was something quieter, something heavier. The realization that truth, when spoken without proof in the right voice, could become something else entirely in the ears of others. Around her, the room settled again as Ethan moved toward the front, preparing to begin the service. Margaret sat still. But now, she was no longer invisible. She was something else. Something the room had decided it understood. The service did not begin so much as it closed in. Ethan Cole stepped toward the podium, the soft shuffle of paper in his hands signaling the transition from quiet conversation to formal remembrance. Conversations thinned, bodies shifted, and the room settled into a more deliberate stillness. But around Margaret Whittaker, that stillness carried something else now, something tighter, less forgiving. Carol Hayes had not moved far. She remained just within the aisle, her posture upright, her presence controlled, but her attention still anchored to Margaret, as if the matter had not yet been fully resolved. For Carol, order was not simply about silence. It was about alignment. And Margaret, in her quiet refusal to retreat, had disrupted that alignment in a way Carol could not comfortably ignore. As Ethan began speaking at the front, his voice steady but subdued, Carol leaned slightly closer again. Not enough to draw the attention of the entire room, but enough to ensure Margaret would hear. "We're about to begin," Carol said, her tone softer than before, but firmer. "I need you to keep things appropriate." The word lingered. Appropriate. Margaret did not turn immediately. She listened to the words settle in her mind, turning it over once, the way she did with things that carried more meaning than they first appeared to. "I'm not interrupting," she replied quietly. Carol's expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough to show that patience was thinning. "It's not about interruption," she said. "It's about context." Her gaze dropped again, briefly, toward Margaret's coat, then lifted. "We're here to honor someone who actually served." The sentence was delivered without emphasis, without raised volume. But it crossed a line. Margaret felt it, not as anger, but as a hollowing. A space opening where something steady had been before. Her fingers tightened in her lap, pressing against the fabric until she could feel the photograph beneath her palm. For a moment, she considered letting it go, letting the room believe what it wanted. It would have been easier, quieter. But something in her, the same quiet instinct that had carried her through years of waiting, of not knowing, of holding on to things no one else could see, did not allow it. Her hand moved. Slowly, carefully, she reached into her coat again. This time, the movement was not hidden. It was visible, deliberate, drawing the attention of those already watching. Carol's eyes followed immediately. Margaret pulled the photograph out, unfolding it with more care than before. The edges trembled slightly, not from fear, but from age, from the small unsteadiness that came with time. She held it for a moment, looking down at it. The image had not changed, even if everything around it had. Then she lifted it, not high, not for display, just enough. "My son," she said again. Carol did not hesitate this time. She reached out and took the photograph with a practiced motion, her fingers holding it at the corners, as though it were something that needed to be handled, but not valued. Her eyes moved across it. Uniform, posture, the dog at the man's side. A Belgian Malinois or German Shepherd, she couldn't tell, and she didn't try to. She had already decided. "I don't know where you found this," Carol said, her voice still low, still controlled, but stripped now of its earlier softness. "But this isn't the place for stories." "They're not stories," Margaret replied. It was the first time her voice carried something beyond quietness. Not volume, not anger. Certainty. Carol exhaled lightly, a sound that carried impatience more than amusement. "This isn't about what you believe," she said. "It's about what can be proven." A man seated 2 rows over leaned slightly toward his neighbor, his voice just loud enough to be heard. "Pictures like that are everywhere these days," he murmured. "Internet's full of them." The comment slipped into the space like something expected, not challenged, not corrected. Margaret heard it. She did not look toward the man. She did not respond. Carol held the photograph a moment longer, then handed it back, not carelessly, but without weight. "You should keep it to yourself," she said. Then, with a small, decisive motion, she gestured toward the seat. "That's enough." Margaret took the photograph back, her fingers closing around it more firmly now. She did not speak again. She did not argue. Instead, she lowered her hand and placed the photograph beside her on the pew, not returning it to her pocket immediately. The wood beneath it was cold. For a brief moment, her hand rested over it, as if anchoring it in place. Then she withdrew her hand and folded both of them back into her lap. Around her, the room had shifted again. Not louder, not openly hostile, but settled into something final. The kind of quiet that follows a conclusion. At the front, Ethan continued speaking, unaware of the full exchange, but not untouched by the change in the room. His gaze moved once across the pews, pausing, just briefly, on the section where Margaret sat. Something about the name had stayed with him. Whitaker. He had heard it before. Not recently, not often, but in a context that mattered. Ethan was not a man given to quick conclusions. At 35, with a lean frame and a face that carried more responsibility than ease, he had spent much of his life learning to read between what was said and what was left unsaid. His father had been the same way, quiet, observant, careful about what he chose to believe. And something about the way Margaret had spoken, without performance, without hesitation, did not match what he had just witnessed. His voice continued, steady, carrying through the room. But his attention shifted. Subtly, without breaking rhythm, Ethan stepped slightly back from the podium, his hand lowering toward the side table where his phone rested among a stack of folded programs. He picked it up without drawing attention, his movements masked by the natural flow of the service. His thumb moved quickly across the screen. Whitaker. The name returned again, clearer now. There had been a conversation, months ago. His father mentioning a Marine, someone local, someone who had worked with a canine unit. Not a story, a detail. The kind of thing Thomas Hale had never exaggerated. Ethan's jaw tightened slightly. Without looking down again, he typed, "Your mom is here. Something's wrong." He hesitated only a second before sending it. The message left his phone quietly, unnoticed by anyone around him. Ethan set the device back in place and returned fully to the podium, his voice steady once more. In the pews, Margaret sat unmoving. The photograph remained beside her, untouched now. She did not look at it. She did not look at anyone. But something in her expression had changed. Not broken, not visibly shaken, but emptied of expectation. The room had decided what she was. And for now, it was enough. The message reached him in the middle of motion. Staff Sergeant Lucas Whitaker stood beside a dark pickup truck parked along a quiet street just outside Helena, Montana, the engine still ticking faintly from recent use. The morning air was sharp, carrying the clean bite of winter, and his breath lingered briefly with each exhale. At 38, Lucas carried the kind of presence that didn't need to be announced. Broad-shouldered, solid without excess, built from years of functional strength rather than appearance. His face was angular, defined by a squared jaw and a close-trimmed beard that never quite softened his expression. His hair was cut short in regulation style, dark with early threads of gray at the temples, and his eyes, steel blue, steady, moved with quiet precision, always assessing, always measuring. He had just returned from a short training rotation and was on limited leave, staying not far from town. He had not planned to go anywhere that morning. Then his phone vibrated. Lucas glanced down, his movements efficient, instinctive. He read the message once. "Your mom is here. Something's wrong." He didn't ask who sent it. The name, Ethan Cole, was enough. Lucas remembered it now. A passing mention months ago, his mother talking about someone in town, someone her late husband had known. It was the kind of detail Lucas stored without realizing it, filed away until needed. He didn't reply immediately. He didn't need to. Lucas lifted his gaze, already calculating distance, time, route. The church wasn't far. 15 minutes, maybe 20 with traffic. Less if the roads were clear. He opened the passenger door. Inside, a German shepherd sat upright, alert even at rest. Ranger was 5 years old, a working canine with a lean, powerful frame and rich amber-brown fur layered over a darker saddle across his back. His ears stood erect, his posture controlled, and his eyes, deep, intelligent, locked onto Lucas the moment the door opened. There was a faint scar near his right ear, pale against the darker fur, a mark from early training that had never slowed him down. Ranger didn't bark, didn't move unnecessarily. He simply waited. Lucas gave a single, quiet nod. Up. Ranger stepped out smoothly, landing without sound, his body aligning immediately beside Lucas's left leg. No leash was needed for control, though Lucas clipped one on out of habit. Discipline wasn't just about necessity, it was about consistency. Lucas moved around the truck, opened the driver's door, and slid inside. Ranger followed without hesitation, settling into place with the same controlled stillness he carried everywhere. The engine started. Lucas didn't speed. He didn't rush in the way most people would. But there was no hesitation in the way he drove, no wasted movement, no uncertainty. Every turn was precise, every adjustment measured. His mind stayed quiet. He had learned long ago that reacting too quickly led to mistakes. You moved fast, yes, but you stayed controlled. You observed before you acted. Still, something in the message had shifted his focus. Something's wrong. He didn't know what had happened, but he knew his mother. Margaret Whitaker did not ask for help. She did not draw attention. She endured. Quietly. Always had. If someone had felt the need to send that message. Lucas's grip tightened slightly on the steering wheel. He said nothing. Beside him, Ranger remained still, but not relaxed. The dog's posture had changed just enough, subtle, almost invisible, to signal readiness. He could read tension the way others read words. They drove the rest of the way in silence. Back at the church, the service had begun. Ethan Cole stood at the podium, his voice steady as he spoke about his father, about the kind of man who showed up, who listened more than he spoke, who carried his past without placing it on others. The words were measured, careful, but something beneath them had shifted. His attention, though controlled, flickered more often now toward the back of the room, toward Margaret. She had not moved. The photograph still rested beside her on the pew, untouched. Her hands remained folded in her lap, her posture composed, but her gaze had lowered slightly, no longer fixed forward, no longer searching the room. Around her, the atmosphere had settled into something colder. People no longer whispered openly. They didn't need to. The conclusion had already been reached. The glances, brief, sidelong, quiet, said enough. Carol Hayes stood near the side aisle, her expression composed once more, her attention now directed toward the front, as if the disruption had been resolved. To her, it had. Order had been restored. The moment had been contained. Or so she believed. The sound came softly at first, a door opening. Not loud enough to interrupt Ethan's voice immediately, but distinct enough to be noticed by those closest to the back. A few heads turned. Then more. Ethan paused mid-sentence, just slightly, his eyes lifting toward the rear of the church. The doors stood open. Framed in the pale winter light was a figure that did not belong to the quiet rhythm of the room. Lucas Whitaker stepped inside. He wore his Marine Corps uniform, clean, precise, worn without display. The fabric sat perfectly across his shoulders, his posture straight without stiffness, his presence grounded, controlled. There were no decorations exaggerated, no attempt to impress. The uniform spoke for itself. At his side, Ranger moved with him, the German shepherd's gait smooth and measured, his body aligned perfectly with Lucas's stride. His ears were forward, his gaze steady, his presence neither aggressive nor submissive, simply aware. The room did not react loudly. No one gasped. No one spoke. But everything slowed. Lucas did not look around. He did not acknowledge the room, did not register the attention now fixed entirely on him. His focus moved only once, forward, then to the side, until it found her. Margaret. He walked down the aisle with the same pace he carried everywhere, unhurried, deliberate. Each step landed with quiet certainty, the sound of his boots against the wooden floor echoing just enough to be heard. Ranger followed without deviation. As Lucas reached the pew, he stopped. Margaret had not turned yet. For a brief second, she remained exactly as she had been, her hands still folded, her gaze lowered. Then she looked up. The change in her expression was not dramatic, not sudden, but it was undeniable. Lucas inclined his head slightly. "Mom?" The word was quiet, steady. Margaret's fingers shifted, just once, as if confirming something real had entered the space around her. Lucas reached down, his hand moving without hesitation. He picked up the photograph from the pew where it had been left. He looked at it only briefly, then held it for a moment longer than necessary before returning his attention to the room. Only then did he turn. His gaze moved across the people nearest to him first, then outward, steady, level. When he spoke, his voice was calm, controlled. It did not rise, did not carry anger. "She's been telling the truth." No emphasis, no challenge, just a statement. Silence followed. Lucas's hand rested briefly on Ranger's head, his fingers pressing lightly into the thick fur. "That's my partner," he added. Ranger did not move. His posture remained perfectly still, his presence grounding the space in a way words could not. No one responded. No one corrected. The room, which had been so certain only moments before, now held something else entirely. Not confusion, not fear. Recognition. For a moment after Lucas Whitaker spoke, no one moved. The words did not echo. They did not need to. They settled into the room with a weight that left no space for interruption, no room for interpretation. The certainty in his voice did not demand belief. It assumed it. And that was what changed everything. Margaret Whitaker remained seated, her gaze lifted now, not searching, not uncertain, but steady. The tremor that had lingered in her hands had not disappeared entirely, but it had softened, as though something inside her had realigned. She did not look at the others. She did not need to. Around them, the room shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but in the small human ways that revealed discomfort. A man near the aisle adjusted his coat, his earlier certainty gone, replaced with something quieter. One of the women who had leaned in to listen before now looked down at her hands, smoothing the fabric of her sleeve as though it required sudden attention. Carol Hayes stood where she had been, but the stillness that once read as control now felt different. There was a pause in her posture, a slight uncertainty that had not been there before. At 50, she had built a life on reading situations correctly, on trusting her instincts, on knowing when to step in and when to step back. That confidence had rarely been challenged so directly, and never so quietly. Her eyes moved once, briefly, toward Lucas, then to the dog at his side, then back to Margaret. The calculation behind her gaze shifted. When Carol spoke, her voice was still measured, still composed, but the edge had dulled. may have spoken too quickly," she said, the words careful, chosen with precision rather than ease. It was not a dramatic apology. There was no lowering of posture, no overt display of regret. But it was enough. "I didn't have all the information," she added, her tone even. "That was my mistake." The room absorbed it. No one responded aloud. No one needed to. The silence that followed carried a different quality now. Not judgment, but adjustment. The kind of quiet that came when people recalibrated their understanding without wanting to acknowledge how quickly it had formed in the first place. Lucas did not answer her immediately. He did not nod. He did not dismiss. Instead, his attention shifted downward. The photograph. It lay where Margaret had placed it, the edges slightly curled, the image still visible in the soft light filtering through the stained glass. It had been there through everything, held, dismissed, set aside. And now it rested between what had been said and what had been proven. Lucas bent slightly, the movement controlled, unhurried. He picked it up with both hands, not carefully in the sense of fragility, but with recognition. The way one handled something that mattered without needing to show it. He glanced at it once, briefly. Then he turned and held it out to Margaret. She looked at it for a moment before taking it, her fingers closing around the worn edges. There was still a faint tremor in her hands, but her grip was steadier now. "Thank you," she said softly. It was not directed at anyone in particular. Lucas straightened. He did not look back at Carol. He did not address the room again. For him, the matter had reached its natural conclusion. There was nothing to argue, nothing to expand. Truth did not require elaboration. At the front, Ethan Cole remained by the podium, his posture unchanged, but his expression subtly different. The tension that had threaded through his features earlier had eased, not fully, not completely, but enough to allow something else to surface. Respect, perhaps, or recognition. He cleared his throat once, the small sound drawing attention back toward the front. "Thank you," he said, his voice steady again, though quieter now. "We'll continue." The service resumed, but it was not the same. The words carried a different weight now, not because they had changed, but because the room had. Each sentence about service, about sacrifice, about quiet strength landed differently, shaped by what had just unfolded. Margaret listened. This time, she did not feel the need to shrink into the edges of the room. She did not adjust her posture to avoid notice. She simply sat, her hands resting more naturally in her lap, the photograph now held between them. Beside her, Lucas remained standing for a moment longer, then took the seat at her side without a word. Ranger lowered himself to the floor beside them, his body settling into a calm, controlled position, his head resting lightly on his paws. His ears remained alert, his awareness unbroken, but his stillness carried a sense of completion. The room moved forward. No one looked at Margaret the way they had before. Some avoided her gaze entirely. Others glanced only briefly, then turned away. A few held their attention for a second longer than necessary, not out of curiosity now, but something closer to acknowledgement. Carol did not approach again. She remained where she was, her posture composed, but her attention redirected. There was no need for further words. The correction had been made, and for someone like her, that was where things ended. When the service concluded, people rose slowly from their seats. The sound of movement, coats shifting, footsteps along the wooden floor filled the space once more. Margaret remained seated for a moment longer. Not because she needed time, but because she no longer felt the need to leave quietly. Lucas stood first, then extended his hand toward her without looking down. It was a simple gesture, practiced, natural. Margaret placed her hand in his, and he helped her rise with a steadiness that required no effort to see. They did not speak. They did not need to. Ranger stood as well, aligning himself immediately at Lucas's side, his body positioned with the same precision he had carried from the moment he entered. Together, they moved toward the aisle. No one stopped them. No one spoke. But as they passed, something shifted again. Not loudly, not in words, but in the space people gave them. The subtle widening of distance. The quiet recognition that followed them toward the door. The stained glass caught the light differently now as they reached the entrance, colors stretching across the wooden floor in soft patterns. Lucas opened the door. Cold air slipped inside, carrying with it the brightness of the morning. Margaret stepped forward first. For a brief moment, she turned her head slightly, not toward the room, not toward anyone in particular, but toward the space she had occupied. Then she stepped out. Lucas followed, his hand still lightly guiding her. Ranger moved just behind, silent, steady. The door closed behind them. Inside, the church returned to its quiet rhythm. But something had been left behind. Not a disruption, not a memory of conflict. Something simpler. The understanding that truth did not need to be defended loudly to remain intact, and that dignity, once held without compromise, did not require permission to exist. Sometimes, miracles don't arrive with noise or spectacle. Sometimes, they come quietly, through truth that refuses to bend, through dignity that refuses to break, and through the right person arriving at the exact moment they are needed most. In our daily lives, we may never stand in a church like Margaret or wear a uniform like Lucas, but we all face moments when we are doubted, misunderstood, or judged unfairly. In those moments, faith reminds us to stand firm, to stay honest, and to trust that what is true will always find its way into the light, no matter how long it takes. God does not always change the world with thunder. Often, He changes it through quiet strength, through patience, and through people who choose integrity over pride. And sometimes, He sends someone to stand beside us, right when we feel most alone. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who may need a little hope today. Leave a comment and tell me where you're watching from, or a moment when faith helped you stay strong. And don't forget to subscribe so more stories like this can reach people who need them. May God bless you, protect your family, and give you strength in every quiet battle you face.